Why it's harder to pray in certain cities, territorial spirits. Listen carefully. Have you ever noticed something strange? You can pray easily in one place, yet feel distracted, restless, or distant in another. Same faith, same God, same prayers, but something feels different. Most people never talk about this. They assume the problem is them. They think their faith is weak. Their focus is broken. Their devotion is fading. But what if that's not true? What if prayer sometimes feels harder? Not because God is far, but because the environment around you is loud. Some places feel calm without explanation. Others feel heavy without reason. You walk into certain environments, and your thoughts scatter. Your heart feels tense. Stillness feels impossible. And yet nothing is technically wrong. This is not about superstition, and it's not about fear. It's about awareness. Every place carries atmosphere. Culture shapes how fast we move. Repetition shapes how we think. Pressure shapes how we breathe. And prayer depends on breathing room. Faith does not float above environment. It lives inside it. The places we inhabit quietly train us. Some teach us to rush. Some teach us to stay alert. Some leave no space for silence at all. Prayer does not compete well with urgency. It does not shout. It does not force itself into attention. It waits. And waiting becomes difficult in environments that never slow down. The Bible never describes spiritual life as neutral. It describes life as layered. What we see, what we feel, and what we cannot see. This is not meant to frighten us. It is meant to explain experience. There is a moment in Scripture where a faithful man prays sincerely, and the answer does not arrive immediately. Not because God ignored him, not because his faith was insufficient, but because there was resistance. That was not personal. The story does not blame the man. It does not accuse his devotion. It reveals something deeper. That prayer exists inside a world, shaped by forces beyond our individual effort. This does not mean places are evil. It means atmosphere matters. Noise matters. Pace matters. Pressure matters. And attention is fragile. Prayer requires attention. Some environments fragment it constantly. This is why believers sometimes feel exhausted, without understanding why. They haven't lost faith. They haven't stopped believing. They are simply living inside systems that never allow the soul to rest. And prayer requires rest, not because God demands it, but because the human heart needs it. This is where confusion sets in. Faith remains strong. Desire for God is still present. Yet prayer feels harder. The mistake is assuming faith alone controls the experience. Faith is powerful, but it is practiced inside environments. A loud room makes listening harder. A rushed culture weakens reflection. A pressured life fragments awareness. None of this means God is distant. It means the soul is overstimulated. Some places train people to be alert at all times. Some reward productivity over presence. Some leave no space for quiet. Prayer does not disappear in these places. It becomes harder to notice, not because God has moved, but because attention has been pulled in too many directions at once. This is not about blaming cities. It is about understanding influence. Once you understand this, something important changes. You stop accusing yourself. You stop forcing prayer, and you begin to recognize that environment shapes experience without defining truth. God is not withdrawn, but some places make listening harder, and awareness is the first step toward clarity. And once that awareness begins to form, a deeper question quietly appears. Why does prayer feel effortless in some moments and exhausting in others? Why does the heart open easily in certain places, yet feel guarded, restless, or tense elsewhere? This is where many people turn inward too quickly. They assume the struggle is spiritual failure, a lack of discipline, a weakness in devotion. But Scripture offers a gentler explanation. It suggests that resistance is not always personal. Sometimes it is contextual. The Bible describes spiritual life as something lived within layers, not just inside the heart, but inside environments shaped by people, history, and repetition. Places are not empty. They are formed over time. Every repeated behavior leaves an imprint. Every dominant value shapes atmosphere. Every unresolved tension lingers. Culture trains the nervous system, and the nervous system affects prayer. Some environments keep the body alert, always watching, always reacting. In those places, silence feels unsafe. Stillness feels unnatural. Prayer asks the soul to slow down. In spaces that reward speed, it asks attention to gather in environments that constantly scatter it. This does not mean God is less present there. It means the human heart is under pressure. Pressure narrows focus. Pressure shortens patience. Pressure weakens awareness. Prayer requires awareness. This is why some places exhaust believers quietly, not through persecution, not through opposition, but through constant stimulation. Noise is not only sound. Noise is information overload. Noise is urgency. Noise is expectation. And noise competes with prayer, not because it is evil, but because it never stops. The Bible never tells believers to blame the world. It teaches them to discern it. Discernment is not fear. It is clarity. It is the ability to recognize why something feels difficult without condemning yourself for it. Many people misunderstand concepts like unseen resistance because they are taught through fear. But Scripture does not invite obsession. It invites understanding. When the Bible speaks of struggle beyond the visible, it does not encourage panic. It encourages perseverance. It does not tell believers to fight environments. It shows them how to remain faithful within them. Jesus himself moved carefully through places. He did not remain everywhere indefinitely. He taught in crowds, but withdrew from them. He healed in public, but prayed in solitude, not because the crowds were evil, but because prayer requires space. When environments became overwhelming, Jesus stepped away, not to escape responsibility, but to preserve clarity. This is not weakness. It is wisdom. Some places make prayer harder, because they are designed for consumption, not reflection. Designed for production, not presence. Designed to keep the mind engaged outward, instead of grounded inward. Faith survives there, but it must work harder. And when faith works harder for too long, exhaustion follows. This exhaustion is often misinterpreted. People assume God is distant, but distance is not always spiritual. Sometimes it is attentional. The soul has been pulled in too many directions. Prayer has not disappeared. It has been crowded out. This is why intentional withdrawal appears repeatedly in Scripture, not permanent withdrawal, temporary stepping back, moments of quiet, moments of recalibration, moments where the soul remembers how to listen again. Stillness does not create faith. It clears space for it. And when space is restored, something subtle happens. Prayer becomes less forced. Words become fewer. Awareness deepens. Not because circumstances change, but because attention gathers. This is where many believers misunderstand strength. They think strength is pushing through resistance. Sometimes it is. But often, strength is recognizing. When resistance comes from environment, not identity, you are not less faithful, because prayer feels harder in certain places. You are human, and humans are affected by atmosphere. Once this truth is accepted, shame loosens its grip. Prayer becomes gentler. Expectation softens. And faith stops competing with noise. Instead of forcing prayer to sound louder, the soul begins seeking quieter spaces. Not always physically, sometimes internally. A slowing of breath, a narrowing of focus, a deliberate pause. These small shifts matter. They are not dramatic, but they are powerful, because prayer does not need volume. It needs availability. And availability increases when awareness replaces accusation. This is where understanding transforms experience. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What is shaping my attention right now?" That single shift changes everything, and it prepares the heart for something deeper. And as that awareness settles, another layer begins to reveal itself. Not about places alone, but about time. Because environments are not only shaped by space, they are shaped by repetition. What happens repeatedly becomes normal. What becomes normal begins to feel invisible. And what feels invisible quietly influences the soul. Some places have repeated urgency for decades. Others have repeated fear. Others have repeated ambition, consumption, or distraction. None of this happens overnight. Atmosphere forms slowly, like weather patterns, like habits, like memory. And the human spirit responds to patterns, even when the mind does not. This is why some environments feel heavy, without a clear reason. Not because something evil is happening, but because the soul is reacting. To years of unbroken pressure, prayer enters that space and feels resistance, not opposition, resistance. Like trying to hear a whisper in a room that never stops talking. The whisper is still there, but attention is tired. This is where misunderstanding often begins. People hear words like territorial and imagine something dramatic. But Scripture is quieter than that. It speaks of influence, not domination, of struggle, not ownership, of perseverance, not panic. The unseen, in biblical language, is not meant to terrify. It is meant to explain why effort alone does not always change experience. Faith is not diminished in difficult environments. It is refined. Refinement is slow, often uncomfortable, rarely dramatic. It teaches patience where speed is rewarded. It teaches focus where distraction is constant. It teaches humility where self-reliance is praised. This is why some believers grow deeper in challenging environments. Not louder, deeper. Their prayer becomes simpler, more grounded, less performative. They learn not to fight the environment, but to create inner space within it. This is an important distinction. Faith does not always conquer environments by force. Sometimes it survives them by clarity. Clarity about limits. Clarity about rhythms. Clarity about when to step back. Jesus did not confront every environment the same way. Sometimes he stayed. Sometimes he moved on. Sometimes he withdrew. Not out of fear, out of wisdom. He understood that spiritual life requires margins. Margins for rest. Margins for listening. Margins for renewal. Without margins, even strong faith frays. This is why believers living in intense environments often feel spiritually tired. They are not weak. They are overexposed. Overexposed to noise. Overexposed to urgency. Overexposed to constant demand. Prayer in those spaces requires intentional boundaries. Not walls, boundaries. Moments where attention is reclaimed. Moments where the soul is allowed to stop reacting. These moments do not need to be long. They need to be consistent. Because consistency reshapes awareness, just as repetition reshapes atmosphere. Over time, something changes. Prayer becomes less about words and more about presence, less about pushing through and more about staying rooted. The believer stops measuring prayer by emotional intensity and begins measuring it by steadiness. This steadiness is quiet. It does not announce itself, but it sustains. And in sustaining, it reveals something important. God's presence was never absent in difficult environments. It was always accessible. But access required adaptation, not compromise. Adaptation. A willingness to adjust expectations. A willingness to slow down internally, even when life refuses to slow externally. This is where many believers grow discouraged They expect prayer to feel the same everywhere. But Scripture never promises uniform experience. It promises faithful presence. Presence does not always feel the same, but it remains. And when this truth is understood, a subtle peace enters. Not relief from pressure, but freedom from self-blame. The believer stops fighting themselves, stops questioning their faith, stops assuming distance means failure. Instead, they recognize that prayer is relational, not mechanical. It responds to context. It breathes. It adjusts. And in that adjustment, faith matures, not into something louder, into something steadier. Something that does not collapse. When the environment is heavy, something that remains. Even when prayer feels quiet, this is where the journey begins to turn, not toward fear, but toward understanding. And understanding always leads to a calmer, deeper trust. And as that trust deepens, something unexpected begins to happen. The believer stops measuring prayer by how it feels in the moment, because feelings fluctuate with environment. Noise affects emotion. Pressure affects focus. Fatigue affects perception. But relationship is deeper than perception. Prayer begins to shift from something you perform into something you return to. Not always comfortably, not always smoothly, but consistently. This is where resilience forms. Resilience is not loud faith. It is faith that remains. Even when conditions are unfavorable, even when attention is strained, even when the environment resists quiet. This kind of faith does not panic when prayer feels dry. It understands context. It knows that dryness is not distance, and silence is not absence. Silence is often space waiting to be protected. Many believers give up here, not because they stop believing, but because they expect prayer to always feel the same. They expect consistency of experience instead of consistency of presence. But Scripture never promises that prayer will always feel effortless. It promises that God remains faithful. Faithfulness does not always feel comforting. Sometimes it feels steady, and steadiness is underrated. Steadiness does not thrill, it anchors. This is where discernment becomes essential. Discernment is not suspicion. It is awareness without fear. It is the ability to notice what shapes your attention without assigning blame. You begin to see how certain environments pull your thoughts outward constantly, how some spaces reward reaction over reflection, how constant exposure keeps the soul in defense mode. Prayer does not thrive in defense mode. It thrives in availability. Availability is not passive. It is intentional openness, an openness that says, I will not rush this moment. I will not force feeling. I will remain present, even if nothing dramatic happens. This kind of prayer feels small at first, unimpressive, but it is durable. Over time, it builds a quiet confidence sense, not confidence in self, confidence in presence. The believer learns that prayer does not need intensity to be effective. It needs consistency, and consistency reshapes the inner world, just as repetition reshapes atmosphere. Slowly, something changes, not around the believer, within. Attention becomes less scattered. Reactions soften. Urgency loses its grip, not because the environment changed, but because the believer did. This is how prayer survives in difficult places, not by overpowering atmosphere, by remaining grounded within it. Grounded does not mean unaffected. It means not controlled. The believer still feels pressure, still notices noise, still experiences fatigue, but these no longer dictate the depth of prayer. Prayer becomes less reactive, more rooted, more patient. This patience is not resignation. It is trust expressed over time. Trust that does not demand immediate clarity. Trust that does not panic when answers delay. Trust that understands that God's presence is not fragile. It does not disappear. When environments become heavy, it does not withdraw. When attention is strained, it remains. And learning to remain aware of that presence in difficult contexts is one of the deepest forms of spiritual maturity. This maturity does not isolate believers from the world. It equips them to live within it, without being consumed by it. They stop needing perfect conditions to pray. They stop waiting for ideal environments. They learn to carry awareness with them, not constantly, not perfectly, but faithfully. And this changes how life is lived. Prayer no longer belongs only to quiet rooms. It begins to exist within movement, within complexity, within noise, not because noise disappeared, but because awareness strengthens. This is not mastery. It is humility practiced daily, a humility that admits some environments are harder, some seasons are heavier, some places strain the soul, and none of that disqualifies faith. It simply calls for gentler persistence, and gentler persistence is often stronger than force, because force exhausts, persistence endures. This is where the believer stops striving to feel something specific, stops measuring prayer by sensation, and begins to value presence itself, presence that remains, even when prayer feels quiet, even when the environment resists stillness, even when faith must work slowly. And in this slow work, something profound happens. Prayer stops being a reaction to environment. It becomes a quiet defiance of it, not loud, not confrontational, but steady. And steady faith changes more than intense moments ever could. And when that steadiness settles in, the fear that once surrounded ideas like unseen resistance begins to dissolve, because fear was never the point. Fear narrows vision. Fear creates obsession. Fear turns reflection into fixation. But Scripture does not lead believers into fear. It leads them into understanding. Understanding reframes everything. The idea that certain environments feel spiritually heavy was never meant to suggest danger at every corner. It was meant to explain experience, without turning experience into accusation. When people misunderstand this, they start looking for enemies instead of patterns. But patterns are quieter than enemies. Patterns form slowly, through repetition, through values repeated daily, through habits reinforced over time. And prayer, being relational, responds to those patterns. This is why wisdom is needed. Wisdom does not dramatize. It discerns. It notices how constant urgency keeps the body tense, how tension keeps the mind alert, how alertness makes stillness feel unsafe, and how prayer requires a sense of safety, not safety from threat, safety from constant reaction. This is why Jesus often spoke of peace before he spoke of power. Peace calms attention. Calm attention allows listening. Listening deepens relationship. Relationship sustains faith. When this order is reversed, believers burn out. They seek power before peace, intensity before clarity, action before awareness. And in heavy environments, this only increases exhaustion. But when peace is restored internally, prayer regains its footing. Not by changing the environment, by changing posture toward it. Posture is everything. A clenched posture resists. An open posture receives. Prayer practiced with clenched urgency becomes strained. Prayer practiced with openness becomes resilient. This is where maturity shows itself. Not in volume, not in certainty, in posture. The believer learns to enter difficult environments without absorbing their tension. This does not happen overnight. It is learned through repeated awareness, through noticing when attention scatters, through gently bringing it back, through refusing to shame oneself for distraction. Shame weakens prayer. Gentleness strengthens it. This gentleness is often mistaken for passivity, but it is not passive. It is disciplined calm, a calm that chooses presence over reaction. Over time, this calm does something remarkable. It creates an inner environment that resists external pressure. The believer no longer depends. on ideal surroundings to pray, prayer becomes portable. Not because the world becomes quieter, but because the soul becomes steadier. This is the turning point, when prayer stops depending on where you are and starts depending on how you attend. This does not remove struggle, but it reframes it. Struggle becomes a signal, not a verdict. A reminder to slow down, to breathe, to gather attention again. And in this gathering, the concept of unseen resistance loses its power to intimidate. It becomes descriptive, not threatening. It explains why prayer sometimes feels harder. It does not define the outcome, because outcomes were never the focus. Relationship was, and relationship is sustained, not by perfect condition, but by faithful presence. This presence is quieter than many expect. It does not demand recognition. It waits, even in places shaped by urgency, even in cultures driven by noise, even in seasons of fatigue. Presence remains. The believer does not need to conquer environments. They are not called to dominate spaces. They are called to remain faithful within them, faithful in attention, faithful in humility, faithful in patience. This is the deeper truth that often gets lost. Prayer is not a battle cry. It is a practice of staying present, staying open, staying grounded. And when this understanding settles fully, the weight lifts. Not because the environment changes, but because the believer no longer carries unnecessary fear. They stop imagining barriers where there are influences. They stop fighting shadows and start cultivating awareness. And awareness brings peace, a peace that does not deny difficulty, a peace that does not demand escape, a peace that allows believers to live fully, even in places where prayer once felt hard. This peace does not shout. It settles. And in settling, it restores confidence. Confidence not in self, but in the quiet faithfulness of God, who has never been absent from any place. And that confidence does not demand proof. It does not look for signs in every moment. It does not panic when prayer feels quiet, because it has learned something essential. God's faithfulness does not fluctuate with location, but human awareness does. And awareness is shaped by pressure. Once this is understood, the believer stops fighting invisible enemies and starts understanding invisible patterns. Patterns of pace, patterns of expectation, patterns of constant stimulation. Some environments train the mind to stay alert at all times, not because danger is present, but because urgency has become normal. Urgency keeps the nervous system activated. An activated nervous system struggles to rest, and a restless system struggles to pray. This does not mean prayer fails. It means prayer feels distant, and feeling distant is not the same as being distant. This distinction changes everything, because once you stop confusing feeling with reality, faith becomes steadier. You stop demanding emotional confirmation. You stop interpreting dryness as abandonment. Instead, you begin to listen differently. You begin to notice how often prayer is interrupted, not by doubt, but by distraction. Distraction is subtle. It doesn't argue against faith. It simply crowds it. Thoughts pile up. Responsibilities press in. Noise fills every quiet gap. And slowly, without intention, the soul forgets how to be still. Not because stillness is gone, but because it feels unfamiliar. Some places condition people to react constantly. Emails, traffic, deadlines, crowds. None of these are evil. But together, they create a rhythm that resists silence. Prayer asks for a different rhythm, not withdrawal from life, but a reorientation within it. This is where many believers struggle. They think the only solution is to escape the environment. But escape is not always possible, and it is not always necessary. What is necessary is discernment. Discernment does not look for spirits behind every struggle. It looks for causes behind fatigue. It asks quieter questions. Why am I restless right now? What has my attention been feeding on? How long has my mind been overstimulated? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations. Invitations to adjust posture, rather than assign blame. This is where prayer matures. It becomes less dramatic, less demanding, more honest. The believer stops trying to force connection and starts cultivating presence. Presence is patient. It does not rush the moment. It does not panic when nothing happens. It simply stays. And staying over time reshapes the inner landscape. This is how faith survives in heavy environments. Not by overpowering them, but by refusing to be shaped entirely by them. The believer learns to slow internally, even when everything outside moves fast, to breathe intentionally, to pause deliberately. Not as a ritual, as a necessity, because without pauses, the soul fragments, and fragmented souls struggle to listen. This is why Jesus often withdrew briefly, not to abandon people, but to restore alignment. He understood something modern life often forgets. You cannot pour endlessly without returning to the source. And returning does not always require distance. Sometimes it requires attention. Attention is the currency of prayer. Where attention goes, relationship follows. When attention is scattered, prayer feels thin. When attention is gathered, prayer deepens. This gathering is gentle. It does not force silence. It welcomes it. At first, silence feels uncomfortable. Thoughts rush in. Restlessness surfaces. But if the believer stays, something shifts. The noise loses its grip, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer obeyed. This is not domination. It is freedom. Freedom from the belief that prayer must always feel powerful. Freedom from the fear that quiet means failure. Freedom from the anxiety that something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. You are learning to listen again, and listening is always slower than speaking. The slow learning creates depth. Depth that does not depend on geography. Depth that does not collapse under pressure. Depth that remains. Even when prayer feels simple, simple does not mean shallow. Simple often means true. The believer begins to recognize that God has been present all along, not hidden, not blocked, simply waiting for attention to return. And when it does, prayer becomes less about effort and more about availability. Availability to the moment, availability to stillness, availability to trust. Trust that does not need to be proven. Trust that rests in faithfulness, that transcends place. This is the quiet victory, not over cities, not over environments, but over misunderstanding. The misunderstanding that prayer must always feel the same. It does not. But God remains the same. And that realization settles deeply. It settles the mind. It settles the heart. And in settling, it restores confidence. Not confidence in technique, not confidence in location, but confidence in the quiet faithfulness of God, who has never been absent from any place. And as that confidence deepens, the believer begins to notice something else. Prayer no longer feels like a task. That must be completed. It feels like a place that can be returned to. Returned to gently. Returned to honestly. Not every time with words. Not every time with clarity. Sometimes simply with attention. This is where prayer becomes less about language and more about posture. A posture that says, I am here. Not demanding. Not explaining. Just present. And presence changes how environments are experienced. The city may still be loud. The pace may still be fast. The pressure may still exist. But the soul is no longer racing to keep up. It learns to move at a different speed internally. This is not withdrawal from responsibility. It is a refusal to let urgency define worth. Many believers mistake urgency for importance, but urgency exhausts. Importance sustains. Prayer reconnects the believer to what truly matters. Not outcomes, not performance. Relationship. And relationship does not require intensity. It requires attention over time. This is why some prayers feel stronger when they are quieter, not because God hears whispers more clearly, but because the heart is finally listening. Listening is an act of humility. It admits that not everything needs to be said, that not every moment needs to be filled. It trusts that presence alone is enough. This trust reshapes how spiritual struggle is interpreted. Instead of asking, "Why is this place so hard?" the believer begins to ask, "What is this place teaching me about my limits?" Limits are not failures. They are boundaries that protect life. Without limits, the soul fractures. Prayer helps the believer rediscover where those limits belong. It teaches when to engage, and when to pause, when to speak, and when to remain silent. This discernment grows slowly. It cannot be rushed. It is formed through repetition, through choosing stillness, again and again, even when it feels unproductive, even when nothing dramatic happens, especially then, because prayer that depends on drama does not last. Prayer that depends on faithfulness does. Over time, something subtle but profound occurs. The believer stops searching for explanations outside themselves. They no longer obsess over labels. They stop needing to name every influence, to feel secure. Instead, they rest in awareness, awareness that recognizes when the soul is overstimulated, awareness that notices when fear tries to disguise itself as discernment, awareness that understands that God's presence is not fragile. It does not retreat from cities. It does not withdraw from complexity. It remains steady, even when awareness wavers. This realization dissolves fear, not by confrontation, by clarity. Fear thrives on mystery without understanding. Understanding removes fear's foundation. Once prayer is understood as relational rather than mechanical, much of the anxiety disappears. The believer stops asking, "Am I doing this right?" and begins asking, "Am I present?" Presence becomes the measure, and presence can exist anywhere. In crowded streets, in busy schedules, in heavy environments. Not perfectly, not constantly, but faithfully. This faithfulness is not heroic. It is human. It allows for tiredness. It allows for distraction. It does not condemn weakness. It gently returns attention again and again. This gentle return is the true discipline of prayer. Not forcing focus, but choosing return. Return after distraction. Return after restlessness. Return after silence. Every return strengthens awareness. Every return deepens relationship. Over time, prayer becomes less fragile. It no longer collapses. When the environment is intense, it adapts, not by becoming harder, by becoming simpler. The believer no longer needs special conditions. They do not wait for perfect quiet. They create small spaces of stillness within whatever moment they are in. A breath, a pause, a moment of attention. These moments accumulate. They reshape the inner world, and the inner world begins to feel spacious, even when the outer world is not. This is not escape. It is resilience. Resilience rooted in trust. Trust that God is not limited by place. Trust that prayer is not blocked by geography. Trust that awareness can be cultivated anywhere. This trust does not deny difficulty. It acknowledges it without surrendering to it. And in this acknowledgement, faith matures, not into certainty, into steadiness. Steadiness that does not require explanation. Steadiness that does not announce itself. Steadiness that remains when prayer feels quiet. This is the quiet strength that many never talk about because it does not look impressive, but it endures. And endurance is often the truest measure of faith. As this endurance grows, the believer realizes something freeing. They do not need to escape cities to pray. They do not need to blame environments to believe. They do not need to fight unseen forces to remain faithful. They need awareness. They need patience. They need trust. And trust grows, not through force, but through presence. Presence practiced daily. Presence chosen repeatedly. Presence that says, God is here, even now. And that truth settles deeply. It settles the need to explain everything. It settles the urge to label every struggle. It settles the fear that prayer must always feel powerful. Prayer does not need to feel powerful. It needs to be faithful. And faithfulness, practiced over time, outlasts every environment. And as that faithfulness settles into daily life, the believer begins to notice how subtly everything changes. Not outwardly at first. The city remains busy. Responsibilities remain demanding. Life continues at the same pace. But inwardly, something has shifted. Prayer no longer waits for perfect conditions. It happens in fragments, in breaths between moments, in quiet acknowledgments that do not need words. These fragments begin to stitch together a deeper sense of companionship. God is no longer approached only in designated times. Presence weaves itself into ordinary moments. Walking, waiting, listening. This is where prayer becomes less visible, but more constant. It stops announcing itself. It becomes an undercurrent, and undercurrents shape direction. Even when the surface looks unchanged, the believer notices how anxiety loosens its grip, not because problems disappear, but because problems are no longer faced alone. Prayer stops being a request for rescue and becomes a place of return. Return to clarity. Return to grounding. Return to trust. This trust does not remove difficulty. It reframes it. Difficulty is no longer interpreted as spiritual opposition. It is understood as part of living within complex environments. This understanding brings compassion. Compassion for oneself. Compassion for others. The believer becomes less reactive, less eager to judge spiritual experiences, less tempted to explain everything through fear. Fear thrives on oversimplification. But life is layered, and faith, when mature, honors those layers. It does not collapse complexity into one explanation. It holds space for mystery without panic. This is where prayer deepens most, when it no longer demands certainty to remain present. The believer learns to sit with unanswered questions without rushing to fill the silence. Silence becomes less threatening, not because it offers answers, but because it no longer feels empty. It feels inhabited. This inhabited silence is one of the quiet gifts of long faith. It is not dramatic. It does not impress, but it sustains. Sustaining faith looks different than inspiring faith. It is quieter, slower. It shows up consistently, without needing recognition. This is why some of the deepest believers are the least visible. They are not loud about their faith, because it does not need reinforcement. It has been tested in difficult environments. It has learned how to remain when conditions are not ideal. This kind of faith does not chase experiences. It honors presence, and presence transforms how life is lived. Decisions become less hurried. Reactions soften. Listening improves. Prayer begins to inform choices, not through instruction, but through awareness. The believer senses when to engage, and when to pause, when to speak, and when to remain quiet. This discernment does not arrive suddenly. It grows slowly, through repeated attention, through small acts of faithfulness, through choosing to return again and again. Return to presence when distracted. Return to trust when anxious. Return to humility when tempted to explain everything. These returns accumulate. They form a rhythm that is stronger than environment. And over time, this rhythm becomes home. Home not as a place, but as a way of being. A way of moving through life without being consumed by it. This is the freedom many believers long for, without knowing how to name it. Freedom not from difficulty, but from being ruled by it. Freedom not from cities, but from confusion. Freedom not from struggle, but from fear. Prayer becomes the quiet space where this freedom is practiced, not perfectly, faithfully, and faithfulness reshapes perception. What once felt oppressive now feels understandable. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable, not because strength increased, but because trust deepened. Trust that God's presence does not fluctuate with surroundings. Trust that prayer is not blocked by complexity. Trust that awareness can be cultivated anywhere. This trust does not eliminate effort. It redirects it. Effort is no longer spent trying to force spiritual experiences. It is spent protecting attention, protecting moments of quiet, protecting the space where prayer remains gentle. Gentleness is often misunderstood. It is not weakness. It is precision. Gentleness knows where force is unnecessary, and prayer thrives where force is absent. As this realization settles fully, the believer no longer fears topics that once felt intimidating. Words like resistance or influence lose their power to disturb. They become descriptors, no, not threats. They explain why prayer can feel harder without suggesting danger. And this explanation brings peace. Peace that does not deny reality. Peace that does not avoid complexity. Peace that remains steady. In the midst of it, this is the peace that Jesus spoke of. Not peace as the world gives, not absence of trouble, but presence within it. And presence, once cultivated, changes everything. It changes how places are experienced. It changes how prayer is practiced. It changes how faith is carried. Faith no longer needs to be defended. It simply lives, quietly, steadily, faithfully. And in that living faith, the believer realizes something profound. They were never fighting the city. They were learning how to remain themselves within it. And that lesson, once learned, cannot be taken away because it is not tied to place. It is rooted in presence. And presence, once found, travels with you everywhere. And as that presence becomes familiar, the believer begins to recognize how subtly it reshapes identity. Not identity defined by location, not identity shaped by pressure, but identity rooted in relationship. This is where many finally rest, because identity no longer has to prove itself through spiritual effort. Prayer stops being a way to validate faith and becomes a way to remain connected. Connected to God, connected to self, connected to what is real beneath the noise. This connection changes how the believer moves through the world. Crowded places no longer feel as threatening. Quiet places no longer feel as rare. Both become environments where awareness can exist, not equally easily, but faithfully. The believer accepts that some places will always demand more intention, and that is not a failure. It is simply the nature of living. Within complex systems, once this acceptance settles, resistance loses its emotional charge. It no longer feels personal. It no longer feels like opposition. It feels like context, and context can be navigated. Without fear, this is where peace deepens further. Not peace is comfort, but peace is confidence. Confidence that prayer does not depend on how a place feels. Confidence that faith does not disappear when awareness wavers. Confidence that God's presence is not fragile. This confidence allows the believer to stop monitoring their spiritual state constantly. They no longer need to ask, am I praying enough? Am I feeling the right thing? Those questions slowly fade. They are replaced with a quieter one. Am I present? Presence becomes the measure, and presence can be renewed at any moment. A breath, a pause, a gentle return. Nothing dramatic, just feel attention turning inward again. This simplicity is powerful because it removes pressure. Pressure suffocates prayer. Simplicity restores it. As simplicity takes root, the believer becomes less concerned with explaining spiritual experiences to others. They no longer need to convince anyone. Their faith does not require defense. it is lived, and lived faith is recognizable. Not by word, but by calm. Calm in situations that once caused anxiety. Calm in environments that once felt overwhelming. This calm is not indifference. It is grounded awareness. Awareness that sees complexity. Without being consumed by it, this groundedness begins to influence others quietly. Not through teaching, not through argument, through presence. People notice when someone is not rushed, when someone listens deeply, when someone remains steady under pressure. This steadiness becomes a testimony, without being announced. And this is where the journey turns outward again. Not to escape the city, not to confront it, but to live within it, without losing oneself. This is the calling many believers sense, but struggle to articulate, to remain faithful, in environments that do not support reflection, to cultivate prayer, without retreating from responsibility, to live fully, without being swallowed by noise. This calling does not require extraordinary strength. It requires attentiveness. Attentiveness practiced over time. Attentiveness that gently brings the heart back. When it wanders, this wandering never stops entirely. The believer still gets distracted, still feels tired, still has moments of restlessness. But these moments no longer define faith. They are simply part of being human. Prayer becomes a companion through them. Not an obligation, not a burden, a companion. One that waits patiently. Whenever attention drifts, and when attention returns, it welcomes without judgment. This is where the deepest healing occurs, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through consistency without shame. Shame erodes prayer. Grace restores it. Grace that allows the believer to start again and again, without frustration, without condemnation. This grace transforms how spiritual struggle is understood. Struggle is no longer evidence of failure. It is evidence of engagement. Engagement with a complex world. Engagement with a living faith. Engagement with the reality. That prayer unfolds differently, in different contexts. This engagement matures belief. It replaces certainty with trust, not blind trust, experienced trust. Trust formed through returning, even when prayer feels quiet, even when environments feel heavy, even when nothing seems to change, because something always changes. Awareness deepens. Patience grows. Fear loosens its grip, and the believer becomes freer. Free not from environment, free from confusion, free from unnecessary anxiety, free from the belief that faith must always feel strong. Faith does not need to feel strong. It needs to remain. And remaining over time builds something unshakable, not because it is loud, but because it is rooted. Rooted in present, rooted in trust, rooted in the quiet faithfulness of God, who has never been absent from any place. And when this truth is fully embraced, the journey finds its rest. Not in answers, but in peace. A peace that does not depend on where you are, a peace that travels with you, a peace that settles. And in settling, it restores confidence. Confidence not in self, but in God's steady presence, everywhere, always. And before this journey fully comes to rest, there is one last invitation, not to think more, not to do more, not to understand more, but simply to notice. Notice the way your breathing feels right now. Notice the space between one thought and the next. Notice the quiet that has been present, even while words were spoken. That quiet is not new. It did not arrive because of this message. It has always been there, waiting patiently. Beneath the noise, you do not need to hold on to it tightly. You do not need to protect it anxiously. Simply let it remain. If your mind wanders, that is not failure. Just return. Return to awareness. Return to presence. Return to the gentle knowing that you are not alone in this moment. Prayer does not always require language. Sometimes it is simply attention offered honestly. Sometimes it is stillness allowed to exist, without explanation. You do not have to leave this moment changed. You only have to leave it aware that faith does not depend on perfect environments, aware that God's presence is not fragile, aware that stillness is available, even in the middle of life. Carry that awareness lightly. There is no urgency. You can return to it again later, in another breath, in another pause, in another moment of quiet. And whenever you do, it will be there, as it always has been. Rest here, if only briefly. Nothing more is required, just presence. And peace will follow, in its own time. As this journey begins to settle, there's no need to rush away from it. You've listened for a long time. You've stayed present through ideas that don't always come easily. And that matters, because depth is not something we stumble into by accident. It forms when we stay longer than comfort requires. What you've just experienced isn't meant to change you instantly. It's meant to stay with you quietly. Like a thought that returns later. Like calm that shows up when you didn't expect it. Faith doesn't always arrive as certainty. Often it arrives as permission. Permission to stop forcing. Permission to stop blaming yourself. Permission to accept that some places, some seasons, require gentler faith, not stronger effort. You were never behind. You were learning how to listen in a world that rarely slows down. And that kind of learning doesn't announce itself. It deepens slowly. If this story helped you feel understood, if it gave shape to something you felt, but never knew how to explain, let it continue. This channel exists for that reason. The Soul Spire is not about quick answers. It's about long attention, about faith that matures instead of rushing. There are other journeys here, stories about waiting, silence, spiritual fatigue, and trust, created to be experienced slowly, whenever you need them. If this moment gave you peace, liking this video helps it reach someone else who may be quietly searching for the same calm. Sharing it can offer words to someone who doesn't have them yet. And if you choose to subscribe to the Soul Spire, allows this space to keep growing, so these kinds of reflections can continue to exist in a noisy world. There's no pressure, just an open invitation. You don't need to take everything from the story with you. Take only what feels true. Leave the rest here. And when life feels loud again, when prayer feels difficult, or when stillness feels far away, remember this. Presence is never as distant as it feels. Faith is never as fragile as fear suggests. You can return in another moment, in another pause, in another quiet breath. This space will still be here. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening slowly. And most of all, thank you for choosing depth. In a world that moves too fast, take this calm with you. And come back whenever you need it.